Okay. My name is Karen Hill, and this is the 10th of April, 1984. I'm in Vancouver, and this is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project of the Canadian of Social Workers. Today I'm interviewing Miss Barbara Finlayson. Miss Finlayson, in order to get started, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born.
I was born in Toronto in 1898 and lived there always until away for institutes and for study in the Columbia School of Social Work, but not until I came to Vancouver in 1946, just after war, did I leave Toronto, and I've been here ever since.
You went into social work pretty early. How did you decide to go into social work?
Well, it was war time, and a call came out for high school and other and university students to go and work on farms. I couldn't do that because I get hay fever in the summer, and it would have been ridiculous to go. But I wasn't going to be outdone and not do something that really counted. I had heard of St. Christopher House Camp on Lake Scugog, and with my closest friend, made arrangements to go and see the then head worker, Miss Helen Hart, long since has died. We put up our long hair under our hats, which we wore then, but hoping that it wouldn't burst forth from underneath the hat, which wasn't used to having it. But we really had an interesting time with Miss Hart. She was imaginative, and she told us a little bit about the camp, and then asked us why we were interested. Why were we hoping to go as volunteers? And by the way, and I think we were in the what now would be called grade 13 class, and we told her. And to make a long story short, Miss Ethel Dodds, who followed Miss Hart very shortly afterwards, phoned later after Miss Hart had told her about us to say that we might go, and we went down and talked with her, met her, and heard more about the camp. Well, first I went, by the way, to the camp as a volunteer for a month each of the years that I was in university work. But the first going, of course, I shall never forget. We shall never forget. With workers from the staff of St. Christopher House, a settlement in downtown Toronto, who knew the children, we found our way with 59 little girls. I can't remember the top age, but ranging from about 7 till 12 or so. There were groups of children and adults going to the camp for 12 days each. Little girls and bigger girls and little boys and older boys who had a male worker, and then two groups of mothers with little children up to school age. I can just see those little girls as they ran down the hill. First of all, a walk from the little station, which was barely big enough to hold St. Christopher Camp above it. And we hurried along the the camp road till we came to the dear old farmhouse, which was the center of the camp, and looking down a hill to a semicircle of tents, later framework under them, but at the start not. And then way beyond that, over an open field, was the old mill, which had been made into a lovely play place for rainy days, with a big fireplace at the end. Well, that occasion, that 12 days, and the other camps that I was helping with that year were two groups of mothers and children who left all their burdens, at least as many as they could leave at home, and came with the children. It was just heaven to them. Meals prepared, restful time. The girls had exciting things to do, picnics and hayrack rides and swimming and so on, all the rest. But the mothers at first just wanted to sit comfortably. And some of them knitted, some of them just sat. Their children were being taken care of in various groups and so on. What it meant to them was just everything.
Mm-hmm. Were they quite poor, these people?
They came from St. Christopher House and the district round about. All English speaking mothers. I mean, English speaking and not foreign born. Mm-hmm. Poverty-stricken area in behind the Western Hospital. Mm-hmm. Was the house. It was what was it? About 1918, I imagine it was, and the war was on. Many of them had come from the old country just before war, had not had it long enough to get established, where people, husbands, unskilled and on relief, such as it was then, mm-hmm. Through the winter time. Mm-hmm. Home, congested district, crowded homes, but amazing, especially in the ones from overseas, amazing determination to make something for their children that they hadn't had, mm-hmm. a new country, and so on. I won't go on with that. Sufficient to say that it was heaven, both to the children and to the mothers.
Were there social workers at the camp?
The staff of St. Christopher House were social workers, were graduates of the school, most of them. If not, one of them I remember had training in what would you call it, in dancing and mm-hmm. gym work, mm-hmm. and so on. But apart from that, they were graduates. Mm-hmm. Miss Ethel Dodds, that I mentioned, the head worker by the time we were there, was one of the very early graduates. Mm-hmm. She's better known as Mrs. Cameron Parker, because she married, not then, but later. And then back to university. Mm-hmm. I had been heading for nursing, and there weren't many occupations open to women at the time. Nursing and teaching, very little. Mm-hmm. And though I had amazingly good teachers who meant tremendous amount, even as a little child and right through school and high school too, um, I somehow didn't want to teach, which later I did. But anyway, it was decided that I would go on to university because it couldn't enter the good schools of nursing at that time until you were 21. And so I agreed with my family to go for 1 year. And therefore, after camp started at university, and of course loved it, and stayed on to the end, going each summer for a month to the camp. When I was finished university, the St. Christopher House board, although I hadn't been to the Department of Social Service of the University of Toronto yet, the board asked me to go on to the staff because had been so close to them and they needed somebody and there wasn't anybody in sight. I was really rather glad to do that. I'd had university and I did go with the understanding that the next year I would head for the Department of Social Services. I'm apt to get mixed up on the names of the agencies because through the long span of my experiences, the agencies changed their name. The School of Social Work became the university department later, now a faculty.
Well, you needn't be concerned about it. If I don't understand, I'll ask, because sometimes it's pretty clear from what you say.
Yes, and I may call the Canadian Welfare Council, for example, that's gone through the same process of changing its name. I'll stick to the ones that come most naturally to me.
Yes.
And you ask.
All right, great. So you worked at St. Christopher House for a year as a paid employee, and you then went to the Department of Social Service? Who was the director when you started, when you were at the
school or the St. Christopher House?
The school.
Professor J.A. Dale, an Oxford grad who was in England and in Canada. He had come to Canada to McGill and had, I've forgotten what his title was there, but to a professorship. And he was there for several years. But in England and in Canada had been very, very close to educational work of various sorts. Notably, probably the thing he was best known for was not of the School of Social Work, but of his link with and his help in the development of the Workers' Educational Association.
I've heard of that.
With him on the staff, there was only one other worker. There was a secretary whom we got to know. She was the person that we were very, very fond of in the school. She did all sorts of things for us. But there was, in addition to Professor Dale, responsible for the social work education, was Miss Agnes McGregor, who had graduated in the first year, as I recall, of the school's, the department's life, and the next year went on to the staff of the school as the secretary. You know what? I don't know what she didn't do in relation to because Professor Dale was not well and had many community interests. He was very close to the community, the social work community, and educational undertakings. She, from then until her retirement in just a minute. In her retirement, long afterwards, 19, oh, I think I better not say, but long after, had literally been the holder together of the school. There were many vicissitudes along the way. Professor Dale fell ill. At the other end of my experience in the school, the director fell ill and had to give up the directorship. In between, somebody had left rather suddenly. There were gaps in the directorship, the holders of the directors. But she, from the first, stood firmly and worked and planned on the basis of the very sure sound foundation on which it had been started earlier, not much earlier.
No.
And after she was there with Professor Robert McKeever. From the start, it was deemed basic that the preparation for social work be based on a sound philosophy of the individual, upon experience in one or more of the social sciences, as they were called then, or rather as they had developed then. Those basic, and upon, of course, a belief in people and their worth and their dignity. This was very firmly established, and she helped through all the vicissitudes that she lived through to hold the school on that basis, on the basis of those subjects. Later, requirements before a student entered, but at that point, not. She was, she looked after everything really in an administrative way, and the planning and the following of students in their field work, and so on. And at that stage, that was how we knew her.
Did you do field work when you were at the University of Toronto?
Toronto, oh my, yes, always from the beginning. And there was a close tie with the community too, but precious few organizations that were manned by people that could take the students. I went to the neighborhood workers as a student, having been then 4 years, and I haven't spoken of that, at St. Christopher House. But in going to the school, I asked for field work in the casework setting. I had grown to know the work of neighborhood houses and settlements and so on. It was, as I think of the curriculum in the school, it was meager, but the two subjects that I recall and that were central to me, because I had had university and ethics and philosophy and economics and so on, two subjects that stand out were Professor Dale's, I don't know what you'd call it, I think perhaps it was called The Community. and he made that live. He was really an able person. He made it live. He was also very groomed in literature, and he at 5 o'clock on a given afternoon, if we were near, we came in, and he in his study in the dear old house in which we were housed, near College Street, and right next door, interestingly enough, to the School of Practical Science. We used to come in, and he read poetry to us, which was, to me, refreshing. But the two subjects were the community. I remember him describing once the beloved teacher he had as a growing boy, and he said that he taught the subjects that teacher taught were literature, history. What was the third? I've forgotten what the third one was. But he said, but what he taught was all that makes a man. And there couldn't be a better description of what Professor Dale was himself than just that. We were human beings. We were, we were human beings. We had much to learn, and we learned much.
Learned it.
And the other subject was, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was going to ask you about your fellow students.
The other subject was casework. You see, I was eager to learn about what I'd been learning at camp, more of what I'd been learning at camp. And that was taught by Mr. Stableford, who headed the Neighborhood Workers Association. And it was at the time that Mary Richmond's social diagnosis had come into being. And we learned from it. He was the administrator, and it was somewhat theoretical, and it was only later, much later, that I thought of Miss Richmond in her broader concepts of social work. Then to me at that stage it appeared to be from the social diagnosis. It seemed sort of limited to me. Process, you know. I remember having a discussion with Professor Dale about my feelings, and he said, yes, it may be about process, but go on thinking about what seems to be lacking if you're just having process. That was Professor Dale. Field work, yes. And I went to the neighborhood workers, and my supervisor was Miss Mary McFedrin, whom I came to work with in Vancouver much later. But she and another staff member, Miss Frida Held, were the two at the top of the neighborhood workers with Mr. Stableford, who understood casework and were supervising the casework in the many 8 to 10 districts that it covered.
How was it different doing casework at the Neighborhood Workers Association than what you had been doing at the camp before?
Well, in the interval, I was in the St. Christopher House for 4 years.
I'm sorry.
And just a word about it. In it, I learned about the homes and the efforts and the struggles of the people that I'd met at camp. Struggling to keep their heads above board, struggling for their families, dreadful housing, unemployment, because they were mostly unskilled people. We got bothered about the housing and kept track of so many really little spots of squalor. Many of the houses in the better parts of the district that it served were very well built brick houses on the street. But in what was meant to be the yard of the house had been built cottages, 4 or 5 cottages. And sticking out in my memory was one of the first places I recorded was in those several cottages. There were 28 children under 12, and as well as their parents. The boys were chided by a policeman because they were playing ball on the street. And one of them said, "Well, sir, you've got to play somewhere, and you might as well play where you are when there ain't nowhere else." Well, I mean, that was the case. Happily, St. Christopher House was behind them, not literally. Happily, it provided places to play and things to do that were creative to the boys, but to all of them. And even to the women that came in their large groups. There were women. Well, everybody that became a member of St. Christopher Settlement House was linked with something. The tiny children, preschoolers, had play school with the most creative worker who loved children, understood them, and her patience in helping a number of these children from deprived homes to dispose of quirks, unfortunate quirks, but through singing and stories and marching and dancing and so on, morning after morning, all through the week. Just the mornings, she had them. Well, they were members, the tiny ones. And from there on, there was a system of clubs to which the little girls and the older girls and the young people belonged, and the same for boys. And 2 women's clubs, big clubs of 100 each, they had grown to be when I knew them, who on one night a week, one for each club, they left their troubles at home and came and relaxed and had fun. They belonged to a club, their own club. It was theirs, and woe betide anybody that wanted to tell them what to do. They did their own planning. They had their own officers. They did many things. Folk dancing, speakers that they had asked for or that we had suggested, and so on. But the work with all these varying groups brought to the house and made of it a very real, gave to it a very real family sense, because at home, mother, and there was a men's club too, after war, and they had a club room of their own where they smoked their pipes and talked about war experience and talked about happenings in the community and so on. But at home, often with a mother club member, sometimes a father too, there were never as many of them, but a couple of children belonging to different clubs, they all were part of the family life at home.
Yeah.
And not only in the individual home, but there was a family-ness between the different clubs, and the older ones did things for the younger ones, and so on. They learned responsibility, even the little ones. They learned what they had a feeling what the house stood for. And I remember I was involved in a small boys club, 8 to 10 or something like that. And they in the middle of a club meeting, the president struck his gavel on the table and said, "Hey, you kids, no gum chewing."
Okay.
They went out into the community, all sorts of undertakings during the influenza serious epidemic in 1990. That was before I was there. A whole team of volunteers, along with the staff, because the house had to be closed like the schools were, just pitched in to care for the neighbors. And it brought the community to the house, and it took the community out and helped to them. Well, all sorts of English classes for the foreign born. I haven't said about St. Christopher House that it was in a Jewish committee, a Jewish community, as well as half and half probably English-speaking. Not English-speaking, but I mean people from the old country and from Canada, a smattering of foreign-born. But they went out and that team of workers with a fifth-year med who almost, well on in her training, gave leadership under the health department, and so on and so on. Ever so many sequence of interest of efforts in the community to help in the broader sense. And even within the clubs, I think of the mothers who had been there some time, proposing to do something for the community. And poverty-stricken as they were, and many of them working out by the day, argued and wondered what they would do. They decided on working to endow a cot in the hospital for sick children. And they worked for several years at efforts, pinching even in their limited sense. Personally, too, and when somebody was ill, the baby was taken by another club member, and still another would share the very inadequate supply of wood so that Mrs. So-and-so wouldn't get pneumonia like she did last year, and so on. It was a neighborhood.
I'd like to ask you a question about that, if I may. At some time early in the settlement house movement, workers would live in and serve by, and would teach by example the people who would come in from the neighborhood. Was that the situation when you were at St. Christopher House?
All but 2 members. And there were, in addition to Mrs. Cameron Parker, there were, I think, perhaps 6 staff members, graduates of the school, as I said, and also usually 4 students that lived there, but went to were students in the school. There were 2 members of the staff that didn't. One was the male worker who had a family, and the other, it was not, it couldn't. But that, as you were thinking evidently, played into the neighborhoodliness of the whole work. But coming back, I'm sorry, coming back to your question about how I felt the difference when I went into the neighborhood workers, between the work there and the work in the settlement house. In the settlement house, we were neighbors, friends. When the plumbing burst, they ran to the house to use the telephone to get the city. When something else happened, they came to the house, constantly coming to the house. In the neighborhood workers, people were known to the staff either because somebody had referred them, or they came on their own for help with a family problem of some sort. We had, to begin with, I went to the neighborhood workers in 1925, I think it was, 25, and was there until 1932. For the first, let me think. I went to the neighborhood workers with the assurance that I would be given a work in a district, the leader of which was a good supervisor. I had had Miss McPhedran as a student supervisor, and that was the understanding, and they certainly kept their promise. I had an excellent one, and we were an opportunity really to carry on the learning process of casework. I was especially fortunate because just after going to the neighborhoods, within the first 3 months, and I was glad I'd been there that long even, we had a survey was taken of the agency's work by, I'll give its present name, the what was it? FS, Family Service Association of America. An American organization that had member agencies of the family service agencies throughout the United States. Montreal and Toronto were already members. You had to live up to certain standards to be accepted as a member. Well, this was a survey testing, you see, the validity of the membership, but and it was carried through by an amazing man, Mr. Francis McLean, and Ruth Hill. Mr. McLean, I don't know what he would call himself, but he certainly was a philosopher. That a philosopher whose interests were so closely knit with human beings, and whom he understood. And Ruth Hill had a lot of casework experience. Well, Mr. McLean was there, I don't know how long, at the beginning, a week or 10 days, and came back at the end. But Miss Hill was there for, I think, 3 months. And regular staff meetings she joined, and education of staff was knit into her visit. I wasn't conscious then of what was going on with the upper echelons of staff, but they certainly had Mr. McLean and Miss Hill too. But all the caseworkers were asked to analyze 2 cases, and were given not a form to fill in, but questions that really made you look searchingly at what you. The questions were good, and even after 3 months there, even I learned a lot from the searching work that we did. It was a wonderful beginning. And when there, and Miss Hill told us about all the member agencies, thinking, taking stock, but this was an extra intensive survey of the which, following which our membership was unquestioned.
You mentioned that you had a good supervisor at Neighborhood Workers. Who did you end up with?
It was Mrs. Jewel Driscoll, who later, when Mary McFedrin came to Vancouver, became the second of the witness held at central office, that kept in touch with all the 10 districts, and 8 or 10 at that time, and but she was excellent. And the 2 years that I was with her were broken into because the person that was meant to take over one of the 4 camps at Bolton, Camp for Mothers, fell ill, and they were just very close to the opening of camp, left in the air, and I was corralled to lead this one group, this one camp of mothers, because of the fresh air experience that I'd had, fresh air camp experience. It was a very different experience. I was in charge of the staff and the overall. Do you want to?
No, I'm all right. I just had something in my eye.
The overall work, but relieve no responsibility for the kitchen or the meals. One staff member who was excellent at that looked after the commissariat of the 4 camps. But it was so different in that each 12 days a group of mothers and children came, similar backgrounds, no doubt, but and the same problems at home, but I didn't know them. They came from all the districts of the city, and not only from the neighborhood workers, not only with their knowledge and work with them, but with other agencies. And it was we made fun of the getting to know, because I was really hostess to 60 different women and their children. I didn't get to know all the children, but just the naughty ones.
Yes.
But there was a good staff to look after program, and the different, it was really different, but it was quite a different experience, and a very rich experience. So
you moved into an administrative role from having done casework.
At camp, yes.
Yes, yeah.
And immediately after the second year at camp, I had been urged to go to as the district secretary in Moss Park district. Do you know Toronto? Moss Park is the poorest district at that time, running from the Dawn to Yonge Street and from Carlton Street to the lakefront. It was not a district of foreign-born at all, but but in the main, old country people, all three, Scotland and Ireland and England, and also Canadian-born. They loved their little cottages, which were mostly east of the Parliament Street, and so on. They were families that every year suffered unemployment because the husbands were in the main unskilled, and the poorest of the and getting to know administrative work came upon me with real difficulty then. Not difficulty, but it was an entirely new experience, as well as supervision of first one and then two other workers. We were housed with the public health nurses in an apartment over a drugstore. The nurses when there were must have been 10 or 15, and we were 2 or 3. We had the little office, the little room for an office that was over the front door of what originally, the house that originally had been, and with 2 people working in it. Fortunately, we could interview people in the nurses' quarters because they were out most of the day, but lunch. And the getting to know the administrative work of carrying on the district and the supervising of people. I, having had as little as I had this in the first 2 years. It was really interesting. We didn't have enough room, and if the window was closed, we couldn't hear ourselves. If the window was closed because of the streetcars going along Gerrard Street, we couldn't hear ourselves in the telephone. And if it was closed, 2, and then 3, and after the Depression came, more staff in that little tiny room. It was terrible. Well, in there was no public department as we think of such then.
Public Department of Welfare?
No Department of Public Welfare as we think of them now. There was the House of Industry, which was patterned in some ways after the workhouses in England. Very few stragglers living in the building, but it was responsible for outdoor relief in kind.
And what was given in kind?
Well, unimaginative, I'm sorry to say. The people came home with 2 parcels under their arms. One food, and cereals, and so on, and a few milk tickets, and a few bread tickets. But beans, dried beans, every week, and under the other items, but it's the beans that I remember. And in the other package was fuel for the week, carrying in one arm. Fuel of, I've forgotten what it was, the quick kind of fuel that quickly flares up and heats up. but then it quickly dies down in energy, and those beans had to be cooked. Well, that was the relief. No rent, no payment for gas or electric and so on.
Excuse me.
No clothing.
Excuse me for interrupting again. Could you tell me how the people would use the tickets, the milk tickets and the bread tickets?
How
would they use the milk tickets and the bread tickets? What would they do with the tickets?
Well, there wasn't any rent, but they used the tickets for milk and for bread to eke out and to use the food in kind.
Would they take them to any little store in the neighborhood?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see. Okay. When the Depression came, what happened to your work then?
Oh, everything. The Depression years were really a challenge and an agony. I can still see those people walking, trudging home. The men usually, or if there wasn't a man in the house, the woman, trudging home with those big parcels of inadequate health. As I say, not any clothing, and not any gas or electric or rent. There was a lot of moving through the Depression years. As I say, the Depression years mean the sight of those people with their relief in kind, their faces, and the hopelessness for these people that had never had regular work, the last to get any odd jobs that did come along, and the frustration and the agony that they went through was agony to us to see. As the days went on and the weeks went on, I forgot to say, along with the relief in kind, there was, and I never did know really what it did beyond social service, something or other, of the commission of the city of Toronto, the only job I knew that it carried was, the only role it carried was to make payments to the institutions that existed. There was also, when I went to the neighborhood workers in Moss Park district, somehow connected in its establishment in my mind with Dr. Hastings, who was the internationally known medical health officer in Toronto at the time, because of whose standards in the public health department, the Rockefeller Institute sent many people from all over the world in public health, nursing and in medical. Somehow connected with him had been the starting of a division of social welfare, DSW we called it. It was kind of under the wing of the Social Service Commission, but it certainly didn't grow out of it. It grew out of Dr. Hastings' thinking. And on it was a staff of about 7 or 8 people. Elsie Lawson, that you spoke of when you came in, was one of them. They were competent workers, and they were given charge of the family, the cases of families who were, for some real reason, likely to be permanent responsibilities of the city. They were multi-problem families, always in need, and so on. And they did a really good job with these families. They were imaginative because the families were difficult, very difficult. They did have all of that sort of family, multi-problem. But when the depression, and we had contacts with it, at one point, just as before we realized that the depression was upon us, the two leaders in the central office of that Division of Social Welfare, Mrs. Cameron Parker had gone there by this time to head that up, and Hannah Matheson, a Nova Scotian who was able like Mrs. Parker was in her way. Those two met weekly with Mary McFedrin while she was still in the Neighborhood Workers, and Frida Held. Those four people were all outstanding. They met each week, two from the private and two from the public. Although not public welfare yet as we know it, trying to ferret out and to keep the relationships on a good basis. And just before the Depression was upon us, there had been a plan worked out by which they would take over in the Division of Social Welfare, the public organization as it was, some of the multi-problem families that we had on our caseload in the private. And that was a real undertaking, leaving to us in the private the oncoming cases of younger families, hopefully, as the emphasis was, in order that they might find their feet and not get to be permanent. That was very, very much emphasized. Well, they did take over quite a number of the difficult families that we were carrying, but the Neighborhood Workers always kept a few of the others, because it was hard getting them over because they didn't have staff enough, you see. And but those four people were the beginnings of sound casework in both public and private organizations.
Okay, maybe we could stop there for a second. And as we left off, you were discussing the relationship amongst the four administrators and the relationship between public and private. Do you want to continue on in that?
I'd like to know where the last of that comes.
Do you want to review a minute of that?
Do you mind going back?
That's okay. Okay, now that we've reviewed a moment or two of the tape, perhaps there's some place you'd like to pick up from where you left off.
But that is it going?
Yeah.
But that was the beginning, even though the public welfare development was in its so much in its infancy. The beginning of effort to bring soundness into division between what the public service would carry and the private agency. Those were four able persons. But coming back to the Depression, as I say, the people, their faces, their efforts to keep faith in themselves, in spite of the utter poverty in which they were living, And for us, as the workers in that poverty-stricken district, I see the lineup. Our little office, a long, narrow hall, more and more chairs, the people coming more each day, and sitting, each crowded to the next one along that hall as we tried to carry through interviews with them. And as the weeks and the months went on, not only sitting waiting in that hall, which we tried to make appealing with pictures on the wall of England and Scotland, and with a little narrow table that one of them made for us, and bulbs growing on it. A feeble effort to bring welcome to the office. Then came the time when they were standing up in the stairway waiting. Well, and the staff valiantly trying to be sensitive, interviewing more each day and getting out into the district. The staff had to be added to because the one or two helpers that originally I had couldn't carry the load. We had several, I think of three, well, one from the School of Social Work on graduation, and three who had not had any education for social work, particularly, all carefully chosen. One I think of specially, who, interesting to you, came from the background of an American college. Such a fine young person, and the others too, from other realms. They were carefully chosen, and they stood up well, but with the what they had at hand each day, and the minimal help that I was able to give them, it was really difficult. For me, who was just getting used to supervision and learning from the beginning about it, but fortunately experience with really able supervisors myself, my effort got to be helping them to help the people that they were serving to keep the principles in mind that had been learned by those that were were graduates, and helping the others to learn from them. By this time, we knew that it couldn't go on any longer in the premises where we were, and fortunately, a new house was bought by the neighborhood workers, and not bought by them, but was provided for them through a socially minded citizen, and Kemp House came into being, where again with the nurses, and now with that social welfare worker having a little office, we had much more adequate accommodation. There was a little staff room that we had, where after lunch, on several days a week, the neighborhood workers staff met, and there, in an informal way, we tried to keep the principles of what we were doing uppermost, even though the setting, even though the opportunity to do so was so limited.
Ms. Finlayson, I'd like to ask you a question about the clients. There was some relief in kind available for them. It was in the Depression and poverty was widespread. What kinds of problems, what were the clients expecting of you? What did they ask you for? Money? Counseling?
All the things they needed. We had limited funds, very limited funds, but various organizations like the Poppy Fund for veterans, by a fund here and there through the churches in the district, through the Junior League, had a service just given in Moss Park for extra nourishment and special diets to people for whom medical advice had prescribed.
Mm-hmm.
But we were not able to pay rent unless they were veterans, and then only if they were evicted. Actually, the landlords were amazing in their patience, perhaps certainly prompted in part by the knowledge that if they evicted somebody, they were just as likely to get another one that would need evicting the next month. However, and through the Depression years, I was there till 32. In 1930, the first Unemployment Relief Act was passed, which offered, I can't remember at what point, monetary help was given, but it was only limited help that came with that. They were so afraid of, if given, the instigators and the people in the developing the infancy of the public welfare department were so fearful of giving too much and the people becoming dependent and losing the work ethic. It was appalling, and although the Act came into being and gradually a wider provision being made, they were still far, far from having anything that you would call adequate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another question about the Neighborhood Workers Association, if I may. Mm-hmm. Who ran it? Was there a board of directors? Mm-hmm. And what kind of person would be on the board, for example?
Oh, there was a good board, a really good board. Mr. Stapleford, the director of it, drew in excellent people on the board, but it was uphill for them with meager funds and the conviction that wasn't public work wasn't our job. Nor was there wasn't a welfare council in the city either. The neighborhood workers had been started as an association of workers of the neighborhood. I hadn't spoken in Parkdale, which was my first experience in the NWA, was, as a staff worker, mm-hmm. was, it took me into the monthly meetings of the neighborhood workers in that district. And when I came to Moss Park, that was still another added duty. But and we learned about each other and what each other were doing. and so on. Close tie-up with the churches, which in Moss Park was important because there were a couple of churches there where, or to which came intelligent volunteers from uptown, visiting the people in these years, English people, Scottish people. It meant a great deal to them to have the support of the church and so on. And we got to know them and what they were doing and so on. Now, what was your question?
I was asking about how the organization was run.
Yes,
about the board, and also where the money came from that paid salaries.
Our money came from whatever was the forerunner of the Chest End councils. There was something, I can't remember where the overall came from. It was from voluntarily raised money.
In some cities there
was... Of which Mr. Stapleford was an artist.
At raising money.
He was able in getting, but for the work of a voluntary agency.
Mm-hmm. In some towns, there were organizations called the Charitable Organization Society, which became community chests and things like that. Does that name?
No, the charity organization societies became the family agencies.
Oh,
and as in old London, and the NWA, the neighborhood workers, were the so to speak, the charity organization. I think it was called charity organization in Montreal. I'm not certain of that. Mm-hmm. But as yet, there were the neighborhood workers, and later a child welfare council were going strong before the welfare council took over the work of both.
Mm-hmm. At around that time, the Canadian, I can't remember the name of the organization for sure myself, Canadian Council on Child Welfare, perhaps, was getting underway. And Charlotte
yes, indeed.
It sounds as though you have a lot of memories about that.
Yes. During the Depression years, when the government couldn't understand why all these people were unemployed, and the public felt that they were that they somehow were not adequate people because they were unemployed. What was his name from Calgary that was the prime minister at that time? Anyway, Charlotte Whitten came into the picture. She, having been active across the country, got into the realm of everybody got into caught up in the Depression, and she kept recommending to them the need to put into each city department. They were just beginning in the 30s. Not right at the beginning, but they were just beginning to come into being in the different cities. And her recommendation was put a qualified person in each because they know how to deal with the families. But of course there were many of those competent social workers. They were all busy where they were. Mm-hmm. But they were skeptical about that. The government federal government was skeptical about that, and the provincial governments also. They were very, very parsimonious about giving, and what they did give, they left to what the federal government gave was left to the cities and to the province the Relief Act in the 1930 planned a three-way responsibility of money from the federal, money from the province, and money from the city. Mm-hmm. But there was a firm belief of communities, cities, caring responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Did you have in-person contact with Charlotte Whitten?
Oh, yes. Yes, not for me in the early days of not I think while I was in the neighborhood workers. We were far too busy with getting through the day and doing the best we could to be going to either a professional organization or to the efforts of in the wider sense of planning wisely. Those 4 women that I spoke of, yes, and the administrators for whom they worked, yes, but not us who were carrying the load. Yes, I remember early in my next period of employment in the School of Social Work, going to a conference that Charlotte Whitten organized very early, well, fairly early in the 30s, to which administrators from right across the country came. And it was an interesting conference, a very interesting conference. She worked hard to bring, to advise that good people be put in, but the governments were not responsive at first. Later, there was Nell Wark in Windsor and Bessie Tuzel in Ottawa. Who else? Amy Lee, still later in Vancouver, whom you'll be seeing and interviewing, I expect. But that was very much later in the Depression years. There was government resistance to accept the fact that government had to be responsible in its various levels for, and the federal responsible, federal government in particular.
What about from the other perspective, from you as a frontline worker and then as an administrator, what did you think government should be doing?
That's a good question. Frankly, we had to leave those questions to the people that were in charge of the agency, and because, as I say, the day wasn't long enough. We went home each night. I'm ashamed to say it, ready to tumble into bed.
Tired.
Similarly, with with the beginnings of the professional organization that had grown up, until when was the first date of the Canadian Welfare? Of the CASW.
1928. There was a meeting in 1926, and I think they
were
formally organized.
I didn't belong to the Canadian Association until 1927 because I had been in the settlement and had many evenings taken up. But I was a member in 1927. There had been 2 organizations in Toronto, an alumni of the school and a social workers club. It was a social workers club that was a forerunner of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. But again, in the years I had got started in 27 with the CASW, but during the early years, during the Depression years that I was still in the neighborhood workers, as in the overall planning, we didn't have any leftover energy.
Another question, which may be the last question about this part, is the question of ethics in the early years. You were very busy working at the Neighborhood Workers Association, tumbling into bed each night. To what extent were ethical concerns something that you had to worry about? And what were they? What were the ethical considerations of the day?
The position of these people with families longing to give opportunity to their children, but such inadequate provision to help them when they couldn't earn it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the adaptation of the principles that we had learned of the worth and the dignity of people that were hit so hard. But, as I say, we tried like everything to make our contacts and what we could do.
To do what you could.
Recognizing these principles.
Perhaps my question wasn't as clear as it should have been. What kind of expectations were put upon you as a social worker regarding dress, behavior, hours of work, expenses? Do you have a recollection about any of those things?
You mean the things that unions later took up?
I guess that unions later took up. I've heard things about dress codes and requirements that social workers wear a hat, that they not accept gifts from clients, that later on they had to buy their own cars.
We didn't have cars in the agency,
No.
in the neighborhood workers at that point.
No.
We did wear hats because it was the appropriate thing to do as people. It was just cultural fact that one wore a hat.
Mm-hmm. Would you accept gifts from clients if they would offer you a cup of tea?
We had gone that far in feeling that our relationship in the casework agencies, that our relationship was that of a professional person, although the profession was just beginning. But in contrast to the relationship in St. Christopher House and the other settlements and so on, we were neighbors, and got involved, not as close with this one and not close with that one, but in the kind of services we were giving. We didn't. We kept relationship even in those earliest days with our clients as a client-worker relationship, rather than a friend going out and having coffee and doing things together as friends. We were certainly still neighbors in quotes to them, but not in the sense in the same intimate sense as in the settlement.
Okay. Is there anything more that you'd like to add on this particular period? This would be the period up until you went to the School of Social Work.
I'm wondering, I don't think so, especially. Would you cut it off a little earlier? Maybe you'd, wait a minute, just a second.
Or if other thoughts come to you, we can add it on to the beginning of it. If other thoughts come to you later, we can add it on to the beginning of the next one. I don't
want to add that later. Have you got a minute to think?
Sure. I'll turn this off for a minute.
No, don't turn it on. Just a minute.
No, I'll turn it off.
Yeah.
Okay, having had a minute to think it over, let me renew my request about whether there's anything you want to add about the period before 1932.
Well, a period it was when the public departments were just getting begun, when the pressure on what workers there were in that department, and it was they were developing the public agencies, and in the private agencies. No, will you shut it off again?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, we were, while still under the load of heavy work, day by day, longing for time to get together with our fellow social workers in the CASW. We're longing for the development, which was just beginning, of the local council of social agencies. In order that relationships, appropriate, the close-up relationships of day-by-day work and the overall planning of among agencies that was just begun might develop. Mm-hmm. I think back at the things we tried to do to keep, that I tried to do personally, to keep head above water and help the workers to keep their heads above water, to keep a professional attitude and perspective. The things we recreation for us personally was all too limited. I remember one thing we did was to develop a group. I'm interested in music, and among the largely among the staff members that I'd known at St. Christopher House, to have a singing group every other week in the evening, and to make for ourselves, to insist on our going to lovely concerts and so on. But the recreation was all too brief and very hazardous to our day-by-day worker because mm-hmm. it was so limited.
So social work for you at that time was almost all-consuming.
It was. It certainly was.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can stop there for today. Thanks very much.
I just have, though, I think. Oh, isn't it a nice day? And yesterday with you was pouring with rain.
Okay. You're working fine. Let's see if I'm My name is Karen Hill. I'm in Vancouver, and today is the 23rd of April, 1984. This is a second interview with Miss Barbara Finlayson. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Now, Ms. Finlayson, when we left off 10 days or so ago, we were talking about the Neighborhood Workers Association, and I'd asked you about the funding of the organization. And I understand you've had some further thoughts on how that organization received its money.
Yes, I hadn't. Nothing came into my mind when you asked the question, but immediately later I remembered that there was in Toronto an organization, call it a chest if you like, it was a federation of something in the name, but I remember distinctly the man in charge who discovered that Moss Park could produce stories illustrative of need, and I thought I'd correct that omission. You say you edited them, sure.
Oh, yes, yes, yeah. So, do you want to say anything more about the person who was the head of that organization?
No.
Okay, you finished at the Neighborhood Workers Association around, well, somewhere in the early 30s. Why did you leave Neighborhood Workers, and where did you go then?
It was in 1932 that I went to the University of Toronto School of Social Work to look after the casework teaching. Professor E.J. Erwick was the director at the time, a graduate of Oxford with a rich experience of social work and association with social workers in London. He was head, he was the instigator of and the head of the a little department of the London School of Economics that was responsible for education of social workers in London, in England. He had decided, he had come to Toronto on his way to the west for retirement, but the University of Toronto discovered him, and before he realized he was on the Department of Political Science there, not the head of it, but on it in a part-time way, and from there he became a part-time director in the School of Social Work, not called the Social Work yet, still the Department of, I've forgotten what. Oh yes, it was, well, we'll leave it. Erwick, were two other full-time members of staff, Miss Agnes McGregor and Harry Cassidy. Harry Cassidy had come as a young graduate from Brookings College in Washington, D.C. You'll know him. He came back to the department in later years. Agnes McGregor was a graduate of the first graduating class of the school in Toronto, which was in the year 1914 to 15. And almost immediately on graduation, she was made the secretary of the school. I call it the school because that's what I'm used to saying. It's actually a faculty now, isn't it?
Yes.
She became the secretary. She had the opportunity of working through with the first three directors of the school. The first one had departed rather quickly after his appointment, but with Professor R.M. McKeever, who was then the head of the Department of Political Science in Toronto, and later held the chair of and was director of the chair of sociology at Columbia University. And Professor Dale, an educator, essentially an educator, with Miss McGregor, thought through what they felt to be a basic foundation for the education of social workers. They were entirely in agreement that for such a student required a basis in at least a couple of the social sciences, and the school ever since has adhered to that. Miss McGregor was never the director of the school. She refused that honor several times, and was the acting director in gaps between directorships. Throughout the long tenure of service on the faculty, she was there, I think it was 32 years. She very literally held the department, still young, together. That school has been plagued. It had been plagued before my time on the faculty, and throughout my time, with vicissitudes. Two directors had serious illness, Professor Dale and later Dr. Stuart Jaffrey, and were out of circulation for a considerable time. And later, Dr. Jaffrey, as he was recovering, asked to be relieved of the directorship, but stayed on in the school in another capacity. He was very knowledgeable about public welfare.
Mm-hmm. May I ask you a question about the directorships? Mm-hmm. I understand that here at the University of British Columbia, the directorship was an unpaid position for years. Was that the case at the University of Toronto during the time of which you're speaking?
No. The very first director salary for 1 year, and I don't think he was there for much more than that, was paid by a citizen in Toronto, a very socially minded citizen who was one of the people instrumental in starting that. And and the university, I assume, picked up from there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, as I say, she was the acting director. Miss McGregor was the acting director in the various gaps in directorship which occurred because of these vicissitudes, and literally held the young department together. If you ask what her role was, before I went in to join them, she was at one point called the director of field work, with all that involves. But actually, no one could describe the roles that she performed all through the years, because even when there was a director, they were part-time or were very involved in other commissions and so on. And she was very much in on administration throughout. Mm-hmm. Her final status, I understand, was what was it? Well, I think we better leave that out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How about your role during the years that you were at the university?
Well, can I speak about Professor Erwick first?
Sure.
Professor Erwick, a social philosopher and a graduate of Oxford, as I said, is part in the curriculum was 2 classes. In the first year, a fascinating course in the history of social work. He fairly breathed the atmosphere and the thinking and the feeling of the associates that he worked with for so long. Did I say that he was director of the school in the London school? And Octavia Hill and Sir Charles Locke, Thomas Chalmers in Glasgow, just came alive. It was a fascinating course, and I had the good fortune, at least it was good for me, to have 2 seminars to supplement his seminars, which in turn supplemented his lectures. My seminars were on philanthropy, the history of philanthropy in London, and in Britain, I should say, and also on the English poor law.
Now, these seminars that you speak of, were those when you were there as a student?
No, I mean as a faculty member.
Did you teach those?
Yes. There were seminars, discussion, small groups, supplementing his lectures.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm still not clear. And did you, as a faculty member, did you sit in on those seminars for discussion?
No,
you were teaching them.
Conducted them, but I was taking his course along with the students.
Oh, I see. I see.
Fortunately, I mean, it's a precious possession. The what I got from him. In the second year, his course with the students was the philosophy of social work. Another rich course, which he described himself as being a study of goals for life, which can lead, as he would say, to darkness, but fortunately can likewise lead to help us come closer to the light. Fortunate indeed were the students that had either or both of those courses, and because he just took them to the very basis of living and of thinking, values, basic values that must be applied in all our planning and in our actual carrying through of plans. Such must be tested by what are its vital values. Harry Cassidy's course, when I first went to the department, you can imagine my delight in learning from him, because he had been secretary to a survey that had been carried on in Toronto on housing. And I, coming from Moss Park and having been in the St. Christopher House district, where we were very concerned about the housing and the crowds and the inadequate construction of hovels where people were living, it was fascinating to share with him a lot of his findings. Soon after that report was finished, we went through the writing, not the writing, but the coming into being of his book on unemployment and relief in Ontario, and I've forgotten the date of that, and my copy's in the UBC library. But it was a rich experience being with him. I mean, he was just oozing both these, and his main subject. His main subject was social welfare and policy in Canada. I don't think in Canada. No, in Ontario.
You're speaking about the title of his book.
The title of his book, yes, in Ontario. Just a minute. Responsibilities in the school, where in the main, the casework teaching, the title being Principles of Casework. Professor Erwick was a person who was thinking always in terms of principles. He was less interested in detailed methods, but his eagerness, and he had a strong belief in working with individuals, which he regarded as opening opportunities. In addition to the casework teaching in both years, I was responsible for the field work, for the planning with individual students and with the agencies for the field work of the students. I remember so well, Miss McGregor had done this, and later in the, well on in the 30s, Don McCullough joined us on the staff, full-time staff, and looked after the group work teaching. Miss McGregor gave a course well on in the time I was there on community. Perhaps it was called community organization, I can't recall. But I remember so well our coming together as a threesome after talking with individual students and learning what would be their first and second and third choice of agency. And then comments being made in knowledge of the students of whether number 3 wasn't more appropriate, and so on. And then, after that, the Chinese puzzle of getting them into the, on paper even, into the agencies, after which the 3 of us went to wherever. There weren't many in my day in community organization fieldwork. There weren't opportunities that were appropriate, but there had long been group work opportunities in the settlement houses and casework, and in the casework agencies. At that time, there were relatively few, even in casework, because of the stage of development of the agencies that were really prepared to give field work. It was a heavy load to carry. I'd had pressure in Moss Park with unemployment and all that meant. It was quite a different kind of pressure in the school. Later, well on in my time there, I gave a course in not social welfare, but social work organization and policy. I couldn't have done the social welfare one because I wasn't close enough to the public agencies. But even the gathering of material for the social work organization and policy in Canada at that time was a real ordeal because there was so little written material, and Canada being so broad in its geographic extent, made the getting of really telling material difficult. Mm-hmm. It was a big undertaking. Now, in addition to casework and that other course and field work, and the classes that the other full-time members had, there were a number of part-time lecturers, both from the university, but more from the social work community. Nora Lee gave an able course in child welfare. I've forgotten who it was. A number of there were changes in the person that looked after social legislation, and so on. Courses more directly that impinged upon their work. Charlotte Whitten was an annual visitor to the school. She came for a full day, often, sometimes 2 days, and literally took the students, the second-year students, on an excursion, a large map in front of her, and beginning in Halifax, and steering up and roundabout and right across the country, ending in Victoria. That was really quite an exciting experience. No one could have done it but Charlotte. And she did you ever meet her?
No.
She was a vivid person. It all came alive, and the students got a very, very real, not a deep understanding, but a very real feeling of the essential difficulties in the development of this new profession in such scattered ways, spotty ways across the whole of Canada. She, as I say, that was an annual experience when everything else was cancelled, and she had, and she enjoyed it too. And of course, our students then came, many of them, from afar, because the University of Toronto School had started in 1914, McGill in what was it? I think oh dear, I should have put my hand up. No, I thought I had it. Later, it may have been 18. I can't remember when Dalhousie started, considerably later, and UBC in 1929, I think. But many of the students, therefore, came from a long distance, and we had them from Nova Scotia and from Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine the interest that meant for them. You asked earlier whether in my Moss Park days, when unemployment was so rampant, whether we were participating in any way or hearing about the planning, the overall planning to meet the with government and so on, to meet the requirements for all the work that was being done. And I said that I was ashamed to say, no, we went home from all the lineup of clients that were interviewed, and I, from helping the staff in the district to cope, and were very glad to tumble into bed. We had little even knowledge of what was going on. I wondered, as I was thinking back of these experiences, whether the director of the neighborhood workers, how involved he was. I don't remember of hearing at staff meetings substantial involvement in such. I have a feeling, I may be wrong, that Mr. G.B. Clark of the Montreal Family Services, whatever it was called in those days, whether he was more active in that regard. Mm-hmm. But in the school, and speaking of Charlotte, made me think of the much greater knowledge that I had then of what was going on in the broader sense to meet the needs of the unemployment. Charlotte suggested it to my mind because she, at this time in the Canadian Welfare Council, was extremely active in pressing Mr. R.B. Bennett, the then
Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, as to what he should do about unemployment. He was reluctant to put money in what might make people permanently dependent upon relief. And no wonder no one knew the meaning of it then as we do today. But and she said, you don't put into every civic department as it develops, put a good person, a good social worker who knows, they know what relief does to people, they understand needs. That is the key to protecting. And in that, Harry Cassidy, with whom I would hear her talking, would thoroughly agree. But they were at poles distance from each other about the relief that should be given. Charlotte adhered strictly to the less eligibility principle of the Poor Law in England, in Britain, whereas, namely that nobody should be given on relief any more. In fact, it must be less than he would earn if he had a real job. Harry, on the other hand, was proclaiming in his book that to save the country and the people the recipients of relief themselves, the fate of illness that would affect their whole future. They needed to give relief in terms of what was required for even a minimum of healthy family living.
Mm-hmm. So Harry Cassidy and Charlotte Whitten had some disagreement about the principle according to which relief should be given. I understand that Miss Whitten's proposal to the Prime Minister, I can't remember the details, but that it backfired. Right. Do you have any recollections about her proposals backfiring?
He never accepted the sending of qualified people, and one must remember that when each Harry and Charlotte were saying send a qualified person, I kept wondering where they'd get them all because there weren't enough. Mr. Bennett never accepted that, nor did he ever come out with a plan as was set forth, I think, in 32-34, when Mackenzie King had become the Prime Minister, and the 1/3 from the federal government, 1/3 from the province, and 1/3 from the city municipality was accepted. She didn't get far with Bennett or the, but it came slowly as a snail walks, and gradually the department's strengthened. I remember being at a conference in Ottawa, I guess it might have been Montreal, very early in my sojourn in the school, because I had been so close to the actual giving of meeting the families and their needs. And I shall never forget the experience of meeting. It was the first real conference of local administrators, and they came from right across the country. It was an experience to see to see them, such different characters, and such well, it was just an utterly different experience than the Canadian Conference on Social Welfare, for example, where they were social workers or quasi-social workers. But we're talking about history and pioneering.
There were a couple questions that I'd like to ask you about your time at the school, if I might. And if you're planning on covering these, please just tell me. But they're questions that I would like to ask. One relates to the time while you were at the school that you were active with the Canadian Association of Social Workers.
Well, that was the next thing I was going to speak about.
All right.
I had not been able, during the Moss Park days, to be very active, although I tried to be, because of pressure. But in the school years, I was active in the local branch, and later in the on the board of the national board of the CASW, and those were interesting days. The task that I remember especially that I carried was really almost an impossible one because of the width of Canada and the spotty developments in it. But I was chairman for several biennial periods of what we called a placement committee. It was sort of an employment arrangement. We learned from the individuals right across this country that they would like to have experience in such and such a kind of work, possibly east, west, wherever. We had that information, and with it would require information about what they had done before. And a committee in Toronto, a small committee, because it was an arduous one getting together for these discussions. The plan was that we would select not just from those who were wanting jobs, wanting a change, but also from a fairly extensive material we had about the experience of members wherever they were. And we would select not just an appropriate person, but several whose experience, and from both lists, whose experience seemed to and those would be forwarded to the board member of the agency that was asking for a worker. It was the best we could do with the knowledge that we had of all the workers. It was really not satisfactory, but it helped in many cases to make really good appointments. But as I say, it was a young professional association, and the geography of our country made it, and the scattered, spotty developments made it really difficult.